Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Pets of Politics, Mr. Watson. I am your host, Christian Watson. With me today, I have someone who I have admired for a very, very long time, Miss Cathy Young, who is a columnist, a writer, an author, and all around, in my opinion, brilliant thinker. She's here talking with me today about a variety of issues such as women's rights, men's rights, political theory, and other things that may concern our current contemporary political discourse. Cathy, how are you doing today?
Very good, thank you, and it's an honor to be here. I'm going
Absolutely.
to try to live up to that introduction.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, so let's just start off with the first principles, because I think those are very important, and oftentimes they're forgotten, especially when conversations like this happen. So I've seen you described in the media politically in many different ways. I've seen you described as a sort of as a libertarian, as an individualist feminist, as a libertarian conservative. How do you, Cathy Young, describe your political ideology if you append a label to it at all? If you don't append a label to it, why not? If you do append a label to it, why so?
Sure. Well, it's a tough question because I do find it sort of increasingly hard to label myself, especially in the current political environment, which has been interesting to say the least. Um, I guess, I have often been called a libertarian. I am a contributing editor for Reason magazine, which is the premier libertarian magazine, I guess, in the United States. I have some other libertarian affiliations, the Cato Institute. So, I mean, I definitely do travel in those circles. Um, I do have a strong commitment to individual rights, which is the foundation of libertarianism, of course, and to the view that there should be minimal coercion or certainly government interference, but also societal coercion in both the area of economic activity and in cultural and social relations. Um, I mean, if you look at where sort of conservatives and liberals line up traditionally, there is this tendency for conservatives to want to regulate sort of sexual morality, although these days even that's kind of difficult to kind of align along partisan lines, because you could say that they just want to regulate sexual morality in different ways. So, everything has gotten a little jumbled. It was in some ways a lot simpler in the 1980s when I was really just kind of beginning to get into all of this. And then of course, liberalism has been traditionally defined as, not regulating morality, but, wanting to regulate economic relations and wanting to regulate the economy. And, I really, on a fundamental level, I definitely agree with the Reason magazine principle, free minds and free markets, which you could say really defines libertarianism. On the other hand, I am sort of a pragmatist. I believe that one should look at the realities of what can be accomplished in the existing political environment. I think one has to look at the realities of what sort of the exigencies of, modern society require. I do believe, and I think a lot of people who define themselves as libertarians today believe that as well, that, for instance, in a modern society, you really have to have some kind of governmental safety net because society has really gotten too complicated. We're not in the kind of society where everyone lived in small towns and really your neighbors could take care of you if times got hard. We're just really not living that way anymore. Likewise, I think that given our history, I know that there's been some libertarian debate, for instance, on whether race, sex, etc., discrimination in the private marketplace should be legal or not. Because, under classical libertarian theory, and I think this is what, for instance, Barry Goldwater was arguing in the 1960s, like, if you want to say, well, I just really don't want to have, Black people in my restaurant, it's my restaurant. So, someone else can, like a Black person can open up a restaurant and say, well, I don't want any white people in my restaurant. So, what's the problem, right? And, theoretically, I suppose you could say that, like in some perfect libertarian utopia, maybe that should be the case, but we do have a history where, that's definitely not like the way that things have historically developed. And I think, again, given that history, I just really don't think it, I mean, like for libertarians who want to argue this principle that, you should be able to have an all white restaurant. I mean, is that really the hill you want to die on? I mean, really? And it's interesting because, if you look at, again, historically, like Barry Goldwater, who was, very kind of widely castigated as a racist because, he argued that, on principle that property owners should have the right to decide who to associate with. He actually had a history like because he was also a businessman, and he actually integrated his own like department store, which he owned. So it wasn't that he personally wanted to like not allow Black people in his business. It was that he believed on principle that, business owners should be able to decide, like if I want to say, well, I don't want to have any, redheaded people in my, in my shop, that should be my right. But again, I think you have to look at historically, this is an area where we have certainly not had a perfect libertarian history because, we've had many, many decades of government policies that enforce segregation. And, again, just given those realities, I think we have to look at, what is feasible. So, I mean, I think that libertarianism to me, like the way that I see it today, is a very, very important voice in the political arena, which exerts or should be able to, I mean, I think like in the past 5 or 6 years, it has really been sort of sidelined with both Republicans and liberals sort of embracing different versions of populism. But, ideally, I think libertarianism should be the force kind of pushing back against too much government and saying, let's take a look at whether this is really going too far. So, I mean, would I want to live, I mean, do I think it's possible even like to have a society, today or even at any point organized along strict libertarian principles? Probably not. And I think you do have really difficult questions like, should the government be able to regulate child pornography? I mean, if you were going to be like a perfect libertarian, with a capital L, are we going to say that, well, why should the government establish some kind of arbitrary line, beyond which someone should not be able to participate in a porno movie? I mean, I think, again, if you take that kind of strict logic, I mean, my own view is kind of that if you take the strict logic on anything, you're probably going to end up with something ridiculous because, life isn't logical. And, I think that's something that I'm much more aware of today than I was in college, as is probably the case with most of us. So, I mean, I have, to the extent that I have a sort of, I mean, you mentioned that I've been described as a libertarian conservative. I mean, I grew up under Reaganism. I mean, I came to this country really from the Soviet Union in 1980, and like at the tail end of the Jimmy Carter presidency. And, I thought, I mean, I was very kind of excited by a lot of what Reagan was doing. I thought, his approach to the Cold War was correct. And I think, it was ultimately vindicated. You can argue about the reasons, like the specific reasons that the Soviet Union ceased to exist. But, I think that one area where I even back then and today I've sort of had differences with libertarianism is that libertarianism tends to be like extremely non-interventionist, not just in terms of wars, but just generally in terms of the United States playing a kind of leadership role in the world. And I can understand why like that's appealing in the wake of the war in Iraq, which by the way, I always had mixed feelings about. I mean, you can sort of go back to some of the things that I wrote, back then. And I thought, like it just struck me as really foolhardy that a lot of people were saying, oh, like we can go into Iraq and build and help build this, model democracy in the Arab world. And I'm like, really? Like, what makes you think that that's going to work? That's so that was to me, I thought that was a hugely complicated issue. I mean, I am sort of instinctively in favor of like getting rid of totalitarian monsters like Saddam Hussein. And it's interesting, by the way, that if you look at like surveys of Iraqi people, like you can see something like 70% will actually say, like even today, that as much as they hate a lot of what happened during the war, they also kind of think that getting rid of Saddam was worth it. So I mean, I think interventionism is a real, like even in a case like Iraq, I don't really think there are any cut and dried answers, and I don't think that we know exactly how history will judge all of this. I mean, right now, it certainly doesn't seem to have played out well, but who knows? So yeah, I mean, I just think that generally speaking, non-interventionism is kind of a misguided attitude, because I think it allows a lot of really bad actors to dominate the world stage. And I mean, do we really want to live in a world where the dominant power is China? I mean, I don't think so. And I do think that the United States obviously doesn't have to like go bumbling into like any place where we think we can play a positive role. I think we obviously have to be very judicious about it, but but I also think that we absolutely do need American leadership in the world. So that's a really complicated answer to your question. But so I'm really sort of a play it by ear, depending on the issue type of person, and that's sort of my. I mean, I guess my one like core principle, in addition to whatever we advocate should sort of maximize individual freedom as much as possible, I also believe that ultimately life trumps ideology. And we like if what your ideology dictates doesn't seem to make sense in the context of real life, then I really do think that you have to reconsider the ideology, or at least its applicability in this case. So that's my very roundabout answer to your question.
No, I appreciate it. And what I heard throughout, I heard a few things in that answer, by the way. What I heard, and just at the end of your answer, when you said that's a very complicated or a very, complicated issue, I heard what Whitman said, and talking to myself, I heard I contain multitudes, and we all do contain multitudes.
Right.
And I think that those multitudes are sometimes neutered and shunned in the political context.
Oh,
Because right
absolutely.
now, our political context is so focused on boilerplate ideas rather than actually trying to deeply comprehend what's going on under those ideas. I think that there's a sort of hidden universe to all of our ideas that we should try to comprehend at least a little bit if we want to understand them beyond a superficial manner. So no, I really appreciate you sort of laying down how you approach these things and how you have approached these things for a very long time. And I also heard
and
a lot of.
if I can just interject quickly about
sure,
the specific political moment, I just find it really kind of amusing. Well, not in a happy way, but very kind of telling that we are in a moment where both sides is almost like a curse word, right? And you see that really like all across the political spectrum. Oh, like very fine people on both sides, right? Because everyone loves to quote that line from Donald Trump, which which was ridiculous, but but it just really blows my mind that like the idea of looking at both sides of an issue is considered to be a bad thing. I mean, obviously it it doesn't apply to every issue. Like, when it comes, for instance, to like, raping children, there really is no other side, right? When it comes to like Holocaust denial, there's no other side on that. But, and so on and so forth. Obviously, there are some issues where there is no other side. But I mean, to just establish as this, overriding principle that, oh, well, somehow like my side always happens to be right about everything, and it's just like, what an amazing coincidence, right? So
Yeah.
I just think that really trying at least to consider the other side of an issue absolutely should be a kind of prerequisite
Sure.
instead of a pejorative. So,
Yeah, epistemic humility is the beginning of a meaningful understanding of the world, I think. Now,
absolutely.
and yeah, but when you're in a system that doesn't award epistemic humility, but actually punishes it, because politics has become such a game, and actually it's always been a game throughout the duration of American history. Whether it's with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists fighting over what interpretations of the Constitution are going to be best for the foundation of the Republic, whether it's Marbury and Madison. I mean, politics has always been a game, and there have always been certain levels of the system used by certain players in that game to get to their conclusions. And
Right.
so, I mean, I know that sounds cynical, but I think that's just the truth of the matter. But
Sure.
yeah, I also hear a lot of Aristotle in you as well, because Aristotle is very much about the mean, balance, making sure that you're not going towards two extremes.
Right.
And I do think that this is an approach that is becoming more and more popular in culture. The sort of Aristotelian approach, because when a lot of people learn about virtue ethics and what all that means, at least from my personal experience, they seem to be quite attracted to it, because it's not talking about any sort of overarching rules or domineering principles. It's talking about, okay, what is best in terms of the particular situations that you come into contact with in your everyday life? What is best applied to those things? And sometimes, according to those people, these sort of overarching principles can be debilitating to making good decisions. Practical wisdom, they call it.
Right.
But
Well, I hope you're right that it's becoming more popular. It's certainly
I
something that
think
I would
so.
like to see.
I think so. I think so.
I mean, maybe
Now,
not on
uh,
Twitter, right? I mean,
no, I know. Well, Twitter is its own ecosystem of hell, I like to say.
yeah.
so, and we'll get into Twitter a little moment, because you've had quite a few interesting Twitter battles. But personally, I suppose that how I view things is a little bit less contingent on circumstances and a little bit more adherent to general principles overall. Although I do
Okay.
believe that circumstances are very important for us to consider, especially when it comes to making ethical decisions. If you don't have circumstances, you can't have ethical decisions. But you mentioned that a lot of your political ideas will depend on what works best in a particular situation. And that's all fine and well, in my opinion. But if the basis for those ideas is just what works best in the moment, what about yesterday, or what about tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day? Because, moments are fleeting. So how would we establish a sort of stable political system on the basis of split second or circumstantial decision making?
Right. No, I think that's a really good point, because obviously, what may work in the circumstances of the moment, as you said, is not necessarily going to apply 5 or 10 years from now. And yeah, obviously there have to be underlying, you know basic principles, and that's what the Constitution is for, obviously. And the although of course, nothing, even basic constitutional principles like the habeas corpus can be suspended in wartime, for instance, and there are certain constitutional principles that uh, that may again be sort of briefly suspended in certain emergencies. And those are really tough questions because, of course, where does that logic lead us? There was a time, for instance, when it was believed that the Japanese American internment was justified by the exigencies of wartime. So I think, yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that when it comes to basic rights, we really do have to be very, very strict about observing fundamental principles. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's possible to find. I mean, again, I'm going to sort of strike out a moderate position here and say that we can be flexible up to a point, and I think sort of like moderation and everything, including moderation, right?
Yeah.
So that's me. Yeah. No. I mean, I really think that there is what you just said about the need for basic principles. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely important. And I think as we consider like the needs of the moment, we really do have to also take the long view and ask ourselves, how long is this moment going to last? Is it going to be different, after a certain point? I mean, there's a really interesting question, for instance, about in terms of taking steps toward more socialized healthcare, for instance. Like, if we institute certain governmental rules that are intended to, let's say, help keep certain treatments affordable that right now are not affordable for most people. Are we gonna, could it happen that by doing that, we're gonna kind of freeze a system in place that maybe discourages the development of cheaper alternatives, which is also possible. So I think that's something to keep in mind, and I think that's this is again where I think libertarianism can be a useful corrective. Although I will say that it's actually something I've been meaning forever to write about. I think libertarian critiques, like libertarian arguments on healthcare, really, in my view, have sort of not been able to articulate the points very well, because like when you get, and I'm gonna sort of cite Ben Shapiro here. I know he's not a libertarian, but this is sort of a libertarian argument that
he claims to be.
He claims to be? I thought he was a conservative more than a libertarian.
Well, he has said once that he considers himself libertarian on economic issues.
Right.
Social issues, he's definitely conservative.
Yeah.
Definitely conservative.
So I remember that, Ben Shapiro had this tweet. This is in response to a tweet by Bernie Sanders about, like, it's outrageous that someone needs surgery and can't afford it. And, and I'm, I'll preface this by saying that I'm really not a fan of Bernie Sanders at all. But, so Ben Shapiro responds with a tweet saying, sort of mocking that and saying, well, I went to IKEA and, couldn't afford a couch, how outrageous. And I mean, come on. I mean, most people sort of instinctively will tell you that, not being able to afford a couch at IKEA and not being able to afford, a life-saving operation is really just not the same thing, and some of the, like, I've seen arguments from libertarians basically saying that, well, look at how much the cost of healthcare has gone up, like in the 50 years or so since we've had like more government involvement in healthcare, and doesn't that mean that it's actually government involvement that kind of drives up the cost of healthcare? And I don't know if this is where people are sort of mixing up correlation with causation, because one thing that has also happened, during that period of time, is that there really has been a technological revolution in medicine, and we do have all this expensive technology that can now, diagnose things that couldn't be diagnosed, 50 years ago. I read this account when, during the debates on Obamacare, there was this one guy's story that I read on some forum, where, and this isn't really verified, but I mean, it certainly sounded fairly plausible to me, where this guy like collapsed in a Walmart and got taken to the hospital, and they spent like 2 or 3 days like doing a battery of tests on him, and then eventually came to the conclusion that it was really just dehydration. He didn't have anything. Like, he didn't have a brain tumor, he didn't have any underlying problems, but like the tests that they spent trying to find that out ended up running up a bill of like $25,000. So he gets this, and he didn't have insurance. So he got this bill, and he was able to, I think, negotiate like, a deal where he was able to pay only like $15,000 as long as he paid it right away. So he basically had to like clean out all the savings. And, this is something that would not even really be an issue if this had happened to him like 50 years ago, because at the time, if he had, collapsed in a store and they brought him to the hospital, they would have just, they probably could have like done certain very simple tests that wouldn't involve any technology, because there was no MRI, there were no brain scans. And really, I mean, in his case, it would have worked well for him, because they would have, probably taken like 15 minutes to come to the conclusion that he was just suffering from dehydration, which in this case, took like 3 days and $25,000. But on the other hand, you also would have a case where if somebody, at that point had collapsed, and the underlying cause was like a brain tumor that couldn't be detected by like X-rays, he would probably soon be dead, because they would not they would not detect it in time for him to be successfully treated. So, we have all this technology that can diagnose and treat things that we were not able to diagnose and treat 50 years ago, but it's taking a lot more money. So I think partly, what is happening, what's been happening in the past decades is really kind of society trying to grapple with, how do we keep this stuff affordable for, because we really do not want, like our basic sense of justice, I think, really will not allow a situation where, like if you're brought to the emergency room with the brain tumor and you're poor, they're just going to give you an aspirin and send you home. And, if you're rich, they're going to, put you through all this sophisticated battery of tests. So I think, this is where we really do have to, I think, grapple with the issue of a safety net. And really, like, if you look at some of the kind of classic free market economists like Friedrich Hayek, he actually believed that a safety net was perfectly compatible with a free market society. What he was completely opposed to was the government sort of, directing the economy in a certain way to achieve, certain desired results, like promote, one industry to to make it more successful than another, or to sort of emphasize the production of certain goods and so on. So I think, this is where I think you can make a kind of pro free market argument that also admits, a mixed economy to a certain extent. And, and I think, again, I think a lot of people who are libertarians in their sort of basic outlook, I think will allow for that. So, this is again my, my case for flexibility.
Right. Well, and as it relates to that situation, so I think there are a few things going on there. My opinion. So on the topic of libertarian argumentation, a lot of libertarians, and this is a conversation I actually had with a lad. I'm not sure if you know him. You may have known him. You may know him, called Local Distance on Twitter. I had this conversation with
Oh
him.
yeah. No,
Yeah, yeah,
I've had a few exchanges with
yeah.
him.
I had an exchange with him on my show not too long ago, where he mentioned that his biggest problem with libertarians is that they tend to make economic arguments where a moral argument would do better. Now, I don't agree with that entirely. I think there are plenty of, I think economic arguments can also be moral arguments. I think that there are plenty of
That's
economists who
true.
would actually use economics as a means of establishing a sort of moral core. Although I'm not sure if they're very strong moral arguments, which is what leads me to my next thing. Um, for me, the outcome is important, but I don't want to base my entire system on an outcome. I want to base my system on the principles that allow the outcome to come in the first place. And so for me, as it relates to healthcare, it is, in my opinion, held as a principle that healthcare is a service. Now, having said that, just because healthcare is a service does not mean that I shouldn't care for someone, or that us in society shouldn't try to care for someone if they are at a place where their health is in a very low state. But if we're going to use the principle of property to guide our understanding of what a service is, the idea Locke said mixing labor with nature and then using that to acquire something, then we should probably understand medical care the same way, even if it has a more serious sort of bent to it than most of our other understandings of property. For example, medical care is certainly a more serious a claim of property than rather owning a Bentley would be, right?
Right.
Because medical care obviously could be life or death, or it could just be about conditions that are long
Right.
lasting and could impact someone's quality of life. Having said that, though, that shouldn't have an impact on the principle, which is that doctors have to go acquire skills. They have to go cultivate excellence in their skill and in their field. They should cultivate excellence rather. Not all of them do, but they
Right.
should. And they have to, and then they go and decide to employ those services in particular
Right.
areas, hospitals, practices. And if we're going to follow that moral chain of custody, it would be it would be breaking it to say, okay, this person right here needs help. They're in this situation. Therefore, that entire moral chain of custody, leading back to that first principle of property, is invalidated. I don't feel comfortable living in a system that is based on that kind of ethic. But I also don't feel comfortable
Right.
living in a system where anyone has to suffer for a medical disorder. And for that reason, I want to take individual steps in my own life or organize people to have so that there's more energy and more power in my steps to also take steps with me to help folks who may not have care. I think that's probably the more moral and better outcome as it relates to this issue than perhaps a mixed social safety net that Hayek or even Friedman to a certain degree may have wanted. That's just my opinion, though.
Right. Well, I do want to say, I think that when we're talking about and I really don't want to even get into the whole question of is healthcare a right or is healthcare a service. But I mean, if we're talking about the provision of, don't even really want to get into the whole question of is healthcare a right, is healthcare a service, is healthcare a privilege, and so on. But I think when we're talking about the sort of provision of healthcare, let's say with a role for the government, I don't think we're talking about the government sort of forcibly mobilizing doctors and saying, well, you've got to provide the service at a low cost, regardless of whatever you did to achieve this position and so on. I think we're talking about the question really is, is there going to be a role for the government in supplementing, in sort of pooling communal resources, so to speak, like to supplement the care, to supplement the payments for the care that you receive. We're not talking necessarily about, the doctors and the hospitals not having a property stake in the services that they provide. So it's really not quite the same thing. Although in terms of the the doctor's, let's say, ownership of his or her labor. Well, here's an interesting moral question. Like, let's say that you have several people who are stranded on a desert island, right? Like, there's been a shipwreck, so there's like a dozen people who are stranded on a desert island, and one of them is a doctor who has, the medical skills that everybody else needs. And this doctor basically says, well, like, I just really don't feel like, like practicing medicine right now. I really just want to lie on the beach and, enjoy the sun and look at the birds and whatever. Or, let's say that, for instance, this doctor says, well, like, the only way that I'm going to provide medical skills is if all the women here agree to sleep with me, like, whatever. Like, you could come up with all sorts of conditions. Like, like, let's say that this doctor has like the medical skills that everyone else absolutely needs. Like, what level of compensation can he or she agree to, like, get from other people? Like, let's say one of the women on this island is pregnant, and the doctor, who is a woman, doesn't have any kids, and says, well, I'm going to do this delivery, but the condition is that you're going to have to turn the baby over to me, and it's going to be my baby. I mean, that's a question, right? Like, when would it be moral to, let's say, somehow compel this physician to provide services to others, or to say, well, no, you're not going to be able to get the compensation you want because, that's it, because it's immoral. So, I mean, I think, I don't want to get too deeply into this, because otherwise we're not going to have time to talk about anything else. But
Sure.
I just think that there are all sorts of interesting questions and, moral
Sure.
dilemmas that that come with this.
Would you
And
like me to
there's
answer
really,
any of those, by the way? I mean, and I can like briefly
sure,
touch
go
on
ahead.
very briefly, very briefly.
Yeah.
So about the doctor who doesn't care about giving anyone medical care on a desert island. So again, I think the issue there is that circumstance and convenience are being used to measure the morality of something rather than the sort of principle that brings forth the question of circumstance and convenience in the first place. So the principle there is the principle of self-ownership. That the doctor does own themselves. They own their skills, and they have every right to withhold their skills from those people if they want to. Now, would that doctor probably be a bad person for doing so? Yeah, probably. Would they probably not make it very far on that island? Yeah, probably.
Well, yeah,
Because and
that's
so the principle of self-interest, which is also a first principle, is to be believed. The doctor would actually have every reason to say yes, and if he doesn't, he's not going to have a very nice time on that island.
oh no,
So
no.
I think that you don't have to sacrifice moral principles for convenience. I think that, especially, and this is what the natural law theorists try to get us to realize. All of them, especially, Grotius and all of them, they say that the sociability of man is how it's how we sort of, the environment in which we live. The idea that man is a social animal, and we go and we interact with people in our everyday lives. We build communities with them. That is what allows us and enables us to be fulfilled in life. Or that's part of it. But our interest, our personal interest, our rights, all come before that, but they provide a basis for that. So yes, if I was a doctor in that instance, I would have the right to withhold my service, but it wouldn't make me a very happy or very fulfilled person, and it would
That's a
make
good
my
point.
time there, very miserable. So
That is a good point.
the sociability principle would say, hey, you better go and care for those people the best you can. So that's just my thought. But no, there are a lot of interesting thought experiments in this regard. But I don't want to get too bogged down on this. I would like to
No,
move on
let's not.
to I would like to move on, however, to a point you made about intervention, and just very briefly, because foreign policy is not my strongest area, but intuitively, I do, and from my readings, I do have a sort of non-interventionist philosophy. Not because I've seen what war does, even though war is a ghastly occurrence that I think no human being should ever have to go through that. No human being should ever have to sacrifice their lives for some cause, unless that cause, you can decide that cause is fundamentally just, and even then it's still a very sad thing. I'm against most wars that have happened, especially post World War II, because there is a process that has been enumerated by which the United States is supposed to enter war, and we haven't used that process. And of course, you know what I'm about to say, that process is the declaration of war. We haven't used that process in decades. And a lot of our foreign policy endeavors have happened because of geopolitical considerations, and not out of any real sense of obligation. Now, when I say obligation, I mean, does the United States have an obligation to go ahead and correct the misdeeds of the world? As far as I can see, we don't. But if we have a treaty with someone, this is where the question of obligation gets a little bit more hairy, because that's our word. That's a contract. And for libertarians, contracts are pretty sacred. So I would say, personally, if we have a treaty and we have not invalidated that treaty, we should try to keep our word. And if we find that treaty to be wrong or unwise, we should, through the proper channels, recede ourselves from that treaty. But right now, I think we still have a treaty with Japan. I know we have a treaty with South Korea. I mean, that kind of puts us in their geopolitical events. That kind of necessitates us to go ahead and do those sort of aircraft carrier tests, those sort of jets flying around the sky as a show of force to China. And so
we're also part of NATO, so
and that as well, and that
mutual defense principle,
and that has a lot of parts to it as well. Like, and I think this is my opinion. Maybe you disagree. I think this is kind of where President Trump had a point. The United States was paying a lot of NATO's bills for them, and the European countries had the luxury of not really paying too much into defense because they primarily focus on social safety net systems. And so I think that he made a point. He did it in a very unwise way, but he made a point.
I mean, I think that's a perfectly valid point. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't disagree with that. So, and I think, generally, I think a lot of the European powers definitely did not behave very responsibly, have not behaved very responsibly when it comes to national defense. I totally agree with that. There has been a kind of history on free riding on, on the American defense budget, while bitching about American military bases.
Yes. Yes. Isn't that curious?
That is quite a long history. It goes all the way back to the 80s. So
but I think it's unwise. It's probably unwise as well. And I have personally not seen this being advocated in 21st century America. Back in the 30s and before World War II, this was basically the default position. I don't really see anyone saying, let's not have any diplomatic endeavors in the world at all. Let's be completely isolationist. But
no. I mean, I think that even in the 30s, I don't think anyone was really advocating not participating in diplomatic processes. At least not that I know of. I mean, complete isolationism, is really is not possible.
Especially not in today's economy.
No. But also, I think a lot of the non-interventionist argument, I think, tends to kind of ignore the extent to which, our economic participation in the world markets really necessitates a role for state power. What if an American company in another country gets taken over by, a communist government that comes to power there? What if American citizens who are there, doing their economic stuff, get arrested and thrown in jail by an authoritarian or totalitarian government? And so on and so forth. What if, here's another sort of interesting question, like what if American, let's say, non-governmental organizations that advocate, for instance, for the rights of Christians in Muslim countries, get thrown in jail.
Right.
And this is again where you get into really difficult questions like, are we going to support the right of Americans to engage in political advocacy in other countries? That's a tough question. Do Americans' civil rights sort of stop at the border, or are we going to say no? We're going to go in and not necessarily go in as in send in an army, but we're going to defend. And I think that one of the things that happened, in terms of going back to Trump and his sort of position vis-a-vis other countries. I thought, not that I want us to get into like a nuclear exchange with North Korea, but I think his handling of like the whole North Korea thing, especially after the death of Otto Warmbier, that was just really disgraceful, because I think he just really kind of let Kim Jong-un kind of, get away with murder, literally, like the murder of an American. And I'm not, again, I'm not even saying that like, oh, like we should have found some way to punish him, because how, he's a dictator who's got, who's got at least some nuclear arsenal. But, there is, you don't get lovey-dovey with the guy who just murdered an American. That's kind of like, a pretty basic principle, I think, right?
Mm.
That's so that's which is why I always find it kind of amusing when a lot of Trump fans and I really don't want to spend too much time discussing Trump, but I just always find it amusing when like his defenders kind of see him as this alpha male. Like, no way. Well, first of all, like, what kind of alpha male spends so much time like whining on Twitter about people being mean to him? He doesn't do any work because he's not on Twitter anymore, but now he's whining off Twitter about people being mean to him. So that's like very, very not alpha male.
Well, I think a lot of our politics is concerned with personalities and not principles.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's part of the problem. So, I tend not to talk too much about personalities unless they really have an interaction with a principle in a significant way. And if they do, then I try to.
That's a good approach.
I try to emphasize. So,
I will try to emulate you.
So I think that there are things to be liked and disliked about many presidents, and so including Reagan. I know you mentioned
oh, sure,
you mentioned that you believe his Cold War approach was appropriate, and part of me has questions about that, because the Contra situation, the bloated defense budget, which drew up our national debt. There were a lot of things that he did in terms of his Cold War messaging approach that, to me, have weakened the certain institutions in America. When you blow up the national debt like that, you weaken our financial credibility, which basically weakens almost every other institution in America, because so many institutions in America are linked to our financial credibility. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't like that, but that's how this Federal Reserve economy is ran. And so now in other areas, I think that Reagan was brilliant. I think the Reagan tax cuts were brilliant. I think that Reagan's emphasis on individual freedom at home was brilliant. I think that his partnership with Thatcher to bring down the Soviet Union was brilliant. I just wish a few things had happened better. What do you think about all that?
Oh, no, I don't think, again, I think it's really, when you look at just the sheer scope of the tasks that Reagan was facing, it's almost impossible not to make mistakes. Obviously the Iran-Contra thing was a pretty huge screw up, it doesn't get, and really, because of that, much of a second term was consumed with, scandals. And I just my least favorite type of like politics, by the way, is the politics of scandals. I mean, I just find them so utterly boring because this is where every side, like, right, like no matter what, like one side is going to totally try to stick to its own narrative and try to spin away, whatever doesn't fit, its partisan needs. And the other side is, I mean, no one's even going to try to be like fair in considering the evidence. It's all going to be like 99% partisan, whether it's Iran Contra, whether it's, Clinton Lewinsky gate, I mean, I just really, really, really hate the politics of scandals. So
me too. Me too.
Yeah. Well, yes, we agree on so
it's
much.
a distraction.
But yeah, I mean, Reagan, I think, obviously there are things one can point to, like in retrospect. I do think like one thing that I really admire is that I think Reagan really did have this sort of innate kind of American optimism, and
Yes, he
I
did.
think his position on immigration, I think, was really great in that respect, because I think
Yes.
he really did have a very strong core belief that anyone can come here and become an American, no matter what their origin, no matter what their race, color, creed, whatever.
Yep.
He really did have this sort of shining city on the hill vision where, anyone from any part of the world could come here and not just live here, but actually be an American the same as any other American. And I think this is something that especially stands out today when you look at some of the, and again, I don't want to get too deeply into like Trump as a person, but I mean, there certainly is this kind of group of people around him who I think are not just against illegal immigration, but really dislike immigration, profoundly, and especially immigration from the third world. And I think, I again, I don't want to get into like the whole thing of, are they racist or not? I mean, a lot of the time I think if they're not, they're really doing a pretty good imitation of it, like I think when you look at something like Trump's infamous remark about why are we taking in all these people from shithole countries, right? And and people got into like all this quibbling about, well, maybe it's really not wrong to call them shithole countries because a lot of them are. Yeah, but that's not really the issue. I mean, the question is that traditionally our whole the American mentality that Reagan spoke for was that like if you're someone who is stuck in a shithole country but wants a better life, this is where you should come, right? And we're gonna take you in and we're going to give you an opportunity to build a better life that you could not have had in that country, and then to have this argument that is really the reverse of that it's not just that we're going to say like certain countries are really bad, like no kidding, right? But we're going to say that if you come from one of those countries, like you are an unworthy person who we don't really want here because you're just a burden. And I think that's really the opposite of everything that Reagan believed. And I think in that sense, the optimism that he articulated was really great. And, again, you can argue about specifics, like, there were a lot of people who felt that he was like way too cozy with South Africa, which had apartheid at the time. And, that was something that I think was really sort of about Cold War politics because, South Africa was an ally. And I think, and the Reagan administration, I think, did try to promote like moves away from apartheid. But, arguably they didn't do it enough. And, and I think there could have been kind of a stronger moral condemnation of apartheid. So, I mean, I think, again, I don't think anyone really like represents perfection, but and certainly there were a lot of reasons to criticize Reagan over some specific things, but I think we basically agree. I mean, I think in terms of the bloated defense budget, I think he really did feel that like maintaining the arms race at the pace that it was going really was necessary in order to like really put strong pressure on the Soviet Union. And you certainly could argue that it worked. I mean, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of like dissidents in the former Soviet Union who absolutely idolized Reagan because they
Yeah.
believed that he was he was like not just doing the right thing in, putting pressure on the Soviet Union, but doing the right thing in, just articulating this moral vision of freedom. I mean, I remember, and I have an upcoming article in Reason about yeah, it's going to be the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union in December, which is
Very
amazing,
good.
right? Yeah,
Oh,
and
wonderful.
yeah, and I have this anecdote that I opened with where in 1983, I was 20 years old, and I was on a bus going from Asbury Park to Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I was visiting my first serious boyfriend. So, and I'm sitting next to this woman, and we get into a conversation. And, I mentioned that I'm from the Soviet Union, and I had come here. I had been in this country by that time for about 3 years, and she says, "Oh, how wonderful! How interesting." And then she says, "Oh, you must have been so offended when Ronald Reagan called your country an evil empire because it's like, haha, how ridiculous." And I was like, "Well, actually, I sort of totally agree." And she like, oh, like she was so deflated because she was looking forward to this like moment of agreement when I was
Yeah.
going to totally agree with her that it was ridiculous to call it an evil empire. But now, I mean, I thought that was fantastic. And I had all these, like, I went to Rutgers University in New Jersey, and I had all these arguments with like people who thought I was incredibly reactionary because I was against communism.
Hmm.
And, I mean, I had really, really amusing conversations.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so yeah, it's I mean, we obviously don't know like how things would have played out if Reagan hadn't been president, like,
Right.
and you could argue about whether the Soviet Union collapsed from its sort of own internal sort of conflict. But, I think that Reagan certainly had a role in it. And I think not just in terms of like military spending, but also just of a really strong sense that, the world was standing up, the free world was standing up to the Soviet Union. And I think, in Reagan, I think we had a leader who, when he called, the United States, Europe, and our allies, the free world, you really believe that. And, you believe that he believed that. I mean, are there a lot of people on the scene today who sort of take that seriously? I don't know.
A lot of very interesting points about Reagan and the dynamics of the Cold War. I really appreciate you throwing your experience in there too, because the state of the American university today, I think is it's in disarray. It's in disarray.
Oh, I
Now,
agree.
I'm not entirely sure if this disarray is just new. I think it's been brewing since like the 70s and late 60s, maybe.
Hmm,
Um, with the production of a lot of these academic theories, like critical race theory and
right.
deconstructionism and the advent of postmodernism,
Right.
coming out of the
Yeah.
40s, 50s, and
Yeah.
60s. I think that these ideas have been germinating and changing the function of the academy
Right.
to not simply be a position of pedagogy or gogi.
Right.
I
But
didn't pronounce it,
advocacy.
but
Right.
advocacy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Precisely,
Yeah.
precisely. Have you
Right.
seen that play out in your time
I
studying
think,
and yeah?
yeah, when I was in college, I think it was really just push to have my column shut down or anything like that. I mean, I got occasionally I got some hostile mail, and at the time, by the way, it was like mail that people still literally put in your mailbox because it was really just. I mean, we did have these like computer terminals at the campus newspaper, because I remember that like the first 3 or 4 columns that I did, I actually typed on like on a typewriter, and then they said, well, we would really like you to come in and use the terminals here. All right. Yeah, at the time, like the mail was literally stuff that people put in your mailbox, and I did get some hostile letters. I also got some really supportive ones. But yeah, I don't remember. I was certainly never like the target of any sort of cancellation attempt. And I think today that it probably would have been different, at least from what I know of the atmosphere on a lot of campuses. And I think like in terms of like critical race theory, I think the beginnings of that were starting to show up, but I don't think it dominated the academic analysis anything like it does today. I mean, I remember I took a class in like contemporary political theory where we read a little bit of critical race theory like as one of many things that many ways that oh, I'm sorry, it was actually constitutional law. That's what it was. So yeah, we read like there was a chapter from like critical legal studies, which was the precursor of critical race theory. And we did read Richard Delgado as part of
Wow.
that. But again, yeah,
Wow.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I think we read Delgado. Yeah.
Wow.
But again, it was like one of many things in like here are all these different ways of looking at constitutional law, and this is one of them, which is fine. And this is why like I have issues with like some of the bills that are being pushed to ban critical race theory. I don't think that it would be like even acceptable as a matter of academic freedom to say that, well, you shouldn't have a class that examines critical race theory. I think the issue really should be like when it starts to get to the point of brainwashing, or brainwashing or sort of mandatory sort of inculcation of certain beliefs. And I think, this is where like a little bit after my time, I think like my college years, because I was at Rutgers from 84 to 88. And I think it was sometime after that a lot of schools started to have these like freshman orientation sessions that were really kind of very heavy like ideological indoctrination sessions.
Right.
Reason actually had a really disturbing piece about that by Charles Allen Kors, who is a great guy, by the way, who really has not been getting enough recognition because he was one of the 2 founders of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education.
Very good organization. Very good organization.
Yeah, he was one, and he's now retired, and he sort of hasn't really been on the scene much. But he was one of the first people really to lead the sort of pushback against the encroachments of the sort of the sort of progressive dogma, which really was the beginnings of what we're seeing today. And he did a great piece for Reason. It was in 2000, I think. It was called Thought Control 101, and it was about the way that a lot of colleges were just doing these sort of mandatory workshops where people, it was very sort of Robin DiAngelo type stuff. There was a woman named Jane Elliott. I don't know if she's still around or not, but she was sort of like, she was an early version of Robin DiAngelo, where she was doing all these like white privilege workshops, and like the whole point was to, make white people feel horrible, that, they had all these advantages that, other people didn't have. And I think she actually, like, I mean, in a sense, it was actually worse than Robin DiAngelo, because I think, like, she did these sessions where she would, like, randomly assign half of the people in the workshop to be like the disadvantaged group, and then the others were encouraged to verbally abuse them and so on. And, like,
Wow.
yeah, and that was supposed to be like their taste of experiencing what it's like to be a Black person in America. Like, people just, randomly get in your face and call you dumb and ugly and so on, and so it was just incredible. And and I don't know if like the really extreme version of that was being done in colleges, but it just really sounded like there was some very very questionable stuff going on. And I remember reading that, like, 12 or 13 years after I graduated from college, and thinking, wow, I'm really glad I'm not an undergraduate today. And, and then it's just been getting more and more extreme. I mean, the last time that I visited my alma mater was when there was I think it was actually a Reason sponsored panel. Camille Foster was on it, and, like, people tried to shut him down. Like, but he was actually, Camille was, like, extremely cool, and he was
He's
just
smart
like,
guy. Smart guy.
Yeah,
Very smart guy.
Yeah, and he was, like, totally unflappable, and, like, they tried to shut him down, and he was like, no, I'm gonna say my piece. And so, and I think he actually did manage to get him to shut up, so, which was remarkable. But yeah, but there was, like, this whole event, like, and I forget the title of the event, but it was something about, like, racial politics and freedom of speech, which is kind of ironic because, of course, they tried to shut down a free speech event. How like, this is like
Ironic
proving
that
the
is.
point, right?
Yes,
Like, this is like proving the point that you're supposedly objecting to, which is that, there is a threat of intolerance. And there was very heavy security. I mean, I remember that, like, my bag was searched when I was on my way in, and just the whole thing was that there were, like, repeated disruptions throughout the evening, and just people standing up and chanting, like, to shut down the speakers. And it was, so yeah, that was like, and I think that this is unfortunately where a lot of campuses are at today. And like, you see all these, like, bizarre stories about somebody getting reported by students because they mentioned the N-word in the context of discussing a legal case in which, it was part of the like, it was like a racial harassment case in which an employee was called that word, by coworkers, and, like, the professor's crime was to, like, say the word when discussing the case, and I think he got suspended. And, like, there were actually people who complained, and I think that's I mean, I think that's just insane. I think it's very bad, really, to have these sort of quasi mystical taboos where, we invest, a word with such power that, I mean, it's really very it's kind of like in some, religions where, you cannot say certain words because, like, you're going to unleash all these powers of darkness just by saying the word. And it's crazy. And I think it's really going backward, in my opinion. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I know I don't go to a university that is necessarily as radical as some of the more terrible ones like Berkeley or UCLA or whatever. I go to a relatively mid-tier Southern private university, so I don't get the sort of full brunt of the ideological possession, as Dr. Peterson would say, of many of the students. But I do get a taste of it. I think that every person on every college campus gets a taste of it. And the taste that I've had of it so far is quite bitter, and it is not pleasing. And it's very concerning that there are folks who are going to be going into the workforce and going into society with these mentalities, that's quite foreboding for the principles of our republic. Because look, regardless of what your political disposition is,
Right.
if your basic foundational precepts and how you understand knowledge, how you understand reality, how you understand human beings are based on whittling everything down to its most basic and barest elements and not considering any nuances, not considering any kind of depth, if that's going to be how you operate in this world, I don't think you're going to be able to respect the principles of America. I don't think you're going to be able to respect the reasons as to why America has been the shining beacon in the world in terms of the protection of individual rights. I don't think you're going to be able to respect the process that it takes for a human being to flourish and attain excellence. I don't think these folks are going to be able to respect these very basic things. And beyond the more abstract stuff, I don't think folks who have this sort of deconstructive mentality are going to be able to respect the variation of life itself, just how
Right,
different
or the
and
rights
difficult
of
and
other people to
complex.
have their own opinion.
Yes, precisely.
The
It
rights
comes from
of
this
others.
exactly. So I'm just it's a threat in my opinion. It's an existential threat in my opinion. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but if these mentalities become popular and they already are popular in some areas, if they become more popular and more dominant in how a lot of Americans view themselves, especially young Americans, because it's always the young generation that makes change,
Right.
then we could be
Right.
heading towards some very dangerous pastures. It's my personal opinion.
Oh no, I totally agree. And I mean, I do think that I think we're starting to see some pushback among young people.
Yeah.
I remember seeing somebody said the other day that there was a new poll showing that like the new, like the up and coming like young generations, like the people who are now like 18 to 20, like they're much more negative about cancel culture and more open to different opinions than the slightly older people. So, that may be a good sign. But it's interesting because a lot of people, like when the whole controversy about like safe spaces on campus began, like around like 2014, 15, and I think that there were several like major controversies where students on one campus or another just had a freak out about somebody like, let's say, Christina Hoff Sommers coming in as a speaker, and like they wanted a therapy room where they could process just the sheer horror of somebody like her being a speaker on campus, and and so on and so forth. And I remember like a bunch of people, like the reaction was predominantly, well, like what's going to happen to these young people when they start when they graduate and start working, because they're not going to be able to hold a job, like if they're so fragile about somebody expressing a contrary opinion. And and in a way, like the way it has been playing out so far is that these fragile young people seem to be dictating like the terms to everyone else, and they're the ones intimidating the employers. Like suddenly we're seeing like Goldman Sachs, send out a memo about how, you should, take your time every day to practice different gender pronouns, and, it's just, this really, really kind of weird stuff, and
Yes.
and some of the controversies that we've seen in the workplace certainly mirror the really kind of off the wall campus politics. So hopefully we're gonna see a shift back to something a little more sane.
We could certainly hope
Fingers
so.
crossed.
Now,
Yeah.
speaking of sanity, now let's move on to the men's rights topic. And I'm sorry if we're going on too many different topics. I just want to keep the
No, that's
conversation.
fine.
Okay,
I'm
great. The men's rights topic. So you wrote a piece called "The Broken Dialogue of Men's Rights" in 2013 for the Boston Globe. And I thought it was a very prescient piece, in my opinion. And at the end of the piece, you say the following: perhaps what the 21st century needs is not a women's movement, which was once essential to secure basic rights, or a men's movement, but a gender equality movement. The problem today is not a war on anyone, but rather biases that limit and hurt both sexes in different ways, and the challenges of adapting to new rules and new roles. Men and women, we're all in this together. Let's act like we know that. I think those are perhaps some of the best words uttered in this discourse between feminism and men's rights. Because this has kind of carved out a spot on the internet and in our culture, whether it's in the manifestation of
Right.
the incel culture, which
Oh
I
yeah.
find
Yeah.
particularly concerning,
Oh my goodness.
and yeah, whether it's with people like Stefan Molyneux, who made a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
claims about
Yes.
women that I find very disturbing.
Yeah.
Whether it's with the prevalence, I'm not sure if you know who the gentlemen are, of certain pickup artists or dating coaches, like people who like Tariq Nasheed and Kevin Samuels, who are very internet popular people who, at least popular amongst Black folks, who will say, well, as a woman, this is what Kevin Samuels said last night. As a woman, you're not supposed to work with another man if you're in a relationship. You're supposed to
Oh,
work for your man.
oh
I
my
mean,
goodness.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, there's an entire industry in the men's rights
Right.
world that is pushing
Yeah.
these nonsensical anti-individualist perceptions into the heads of both men and women and influencing how they interact with each other. So
Yeah.
here's my question: have you noticed that what I just mentioned in your own studies of the men's rights movement? And number two,
Right.
how can we unite the very
Mhm.
legitimate issues that men's rights talks about, because some of them are legitimate, the divorce issue,
Yeah.
as you mentioned in your article, with some of
Yeah.
the
Or
issues? Yeah.
false accusations of rape. I
Yep.
mean, I think
Yep.
that's a real issue,
Yes.
and I think
How
that
can we
yeah.
unite the legitimate issues on both sides between feminists and
Right.
men's rights without devolving into the hatred or the reductionism of one of
Mhm.
the other that happens on
Oh
both
well, that's
sides,
a good.
with women saying that all men are pigs or men constitute most of the violent crimes and therefore men are inherently violent, whether it's men saying women need to work for you and don't work for someone else. How do we fix all this?
Oh well, if I knew that, I'd probably get like the Nobel Peace Prize, right?
How do we
So
address it, rather?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that the only thing that we can do really is, try to conduct a more productive dialogue, and you know, and I think that unfortunately, my view is that in terms of like the mainstream conversation, so in the mainstream conversation, the kind of stuff that you just mentioned is really not acceptable, right? That's viewed as extremely fringe, that's viewed as extremely kind of hateful and bigoted, and and these people are sort of mocked or regarded as they're regarded like either as a threat or basically as these sort of irrelevant ass clowns who really should be just roundly ridiculed. um, on the other hand, the same mainstream discourse will sometimes embrace in a very positive way feminist rhetoric that in its own way is just as kind of hateful, and you see some of the really sort of mainstream feminists, like, Jessica Valenti, who I think is not quite as prominent today as she used to be, but, certainly was very prominent a few years ago, basically saying that, we should, anyone who claims to be a victim of sexual assault should be believed at their word. And, we should, um, just a lot of really kind of like even with Me Too, which certainly had some very legitimate issues, underlying issues with the fact that people like Harvey Weinstein, for instance, had been able to get away with some extremely, abusive behavior. And, at the same time, some of the rhetoric was incredibly negative. Some about, all men. Some of the rhetoric was basically like, any flirting in the workplace is unacceptable, just, really demonizing male sexuality in a way. Like if you enjoy video games with sort of attractive women in them, you're probably like a misogynist who is who and just sort of generally a terrible person who dehumanizes women. A lot of like rhetoric that really presumes that all men are abusers, like all men should, like I remember that there was this one Twitter thread by a woman named Christina Catarucci, who at the time, I don't know where she is now, but at the time she was a writer for Slate. And she was writing about, do you remember there was this thing that sort of early in Me Too, there was this thing called the shitty media men list. I don't know if you
Or
remember
what?
this.
Oh, I don't
But this is
know
where
about this.
this woman named Moira Donegan created this basically Google Doc where women could just anonymously report allegations about specific men working in the media. And these allegations ranged from quote unquote creepy lunches, to like unsolicited DMs that direct messages on Twitter that attempted to flirt with somebody. And it was ranging from that kind of really trivial and very subjective stuff, because what's a creepy lunch exactly? And it ranged from that to like allegations of attempted rape. And it's like very obvious, like, wow, like we're gonna have this Google Doc that anyone can sign into and just leave anonymous allegations about like actual people. Well, there is just no way whatsoever that this could go badly, right? I mean, like this is just ridiculous. And Christina Catarucci, and I think the idea initially, by the way, was that this was just going to be this internal thing for the use of the women who were compiling it, so that they could look into like allegations against specific men and like investigate them if there were a lot of people like making allegations about one person. And then of course it got leaked, right? I mean, like who could know, like was there any way that this was not going to happen? Like when there were rumors going around about this document and there were fairly well-known people on it, like what a surprise that it got leaked, right? And then Christina Catarucci, who was a columnist for Slate, has this Twitter thread saying, well, she says, like, I've had men asking me like if they're on this list, and like a lot of men are worried about this. And yeah, like I can sort of understand this, but on the other hand, I think it's really good to sort of keep men on their toes and like have them like go back and review like every single one of their interactions with women and think like, wow, is it possible that I have been abusive? I think you've got to be kidding me. Like this is the kind of stuff where you end up breeding these woman hating like pickup artist types who will just say, well, enough of this bullshit. Obviously like the mainstream system isn't working for us, so let's do this sort of male dominated thing where we men kind of take back the reins of power. And it's like it's incredibly not only is it immoral really to perpetuate this kind of system where you make anonymous accusations about people and then kind of gloat about keeping them on their toes, and really make these just very I think she actually said something like, well, there are no really innocent men. Like, really? You've got to be kidding me. Like, okay, I mean that's really a hateful mentality.
Yep.
There is just no way around that. That's I mean, if you want to talk about hate speech, yeah, that's hate speech. If you're gonna like generalize and dehumanize really an entire sex like that. So it's I think that was an extremely bad kind of direction for Me Too to take, and there were far too many like individual situations in which people just got raked over the coals over nothing, like Juno Diaz, who was the target of these vague accusations where somebody said that he, kissed her against her wishes after a workshop, and then there were these a couple of other allegations which were extremely kind of iffy in the first place, where somebody said, this one woman said that when she criticized something that he had said during a workshop, like he went on a misogynistic rant, and then an audio turned up, where it was really nothing of the kind. So basically, and her response to that, by the way, was, oh, well, the audio doesn't show his body language. I mean, is that really like the best you can do? Like when you accuse somebody of a misogynistic rant and it turns out that they were just responding very civilly to your comments, like what kind of body language? I mean, unless they were like pointing a gun at you. I mean, I don't know what other kind of body language could justify that. So yeah, so there were like three women with, really bullshit accusations against Junot Diaz. And he ended up being he was suspended, I think, by because he was teaching literature at MIT. He got suspended. He did get reinstated eventually, but like the amazing thing was that even like several months or a year after that, I remember reading that a lot of colleges had still taken him off their syllabi because he is viewed as somebody who's kind of tainted by Me Too accusations. And there were other stories. And by the way, the women who like the woman who basically like got exposed as a liar by an audio tape, she was still doing fine. So that's, I mean, I think when a lot of men, when they see that kind of thing happening, I think they're going to be drawn to stuff outside the mainstream that really is kind of woman hating stuff. And and I'm not justifying anyone being a woman hater because of Me Too. I mean, I don't think that two wrongs make a right. But I mean, I remember that like one time I wrote a piece about false accusations of rape, and some guy wrote to me saying like, oh yeah, like I really enjoyed your piece because I think like all women are liars. And really, like, did you look at my byline? Like, who do you think I am? That's, I mean, it's kind of like the fact that you would write to me expecting me to like have a positive reaction to that kind of fan mail is disturbing. So so I mean, I definitely know, and I mean, I've been really careful to like condemn this misogyny, because I know that like when you write about a subject like false accusations of rape, some people are going to take that to to reinforce really anti-woman arguments, because there was this one guy, Paul Elam, who has attacked me like again and again. But like he did a piece, he did this website, and I don't know if he's still affiliated with them or not, but he had this website called A Voice for Men, where he basically wrote like, well, I would never convict any man of rape, like no matter how strong the evidence, because I think like the system is totally stacked against men. Like, okay, well, if this is what you want, like men's rights advocacy to be, like you're not going to win over any sane people with that. So so I think that it's absolutely essential for those of us who criticize the sort of loony feminism to condemn that. But on the other hand, I do think it's there's a certain unfairness in that. I think the loony feminism gets a pass from the mainstream media that the loony men's rights rhetoric certainly doesn't get. And that, and I think this is just really, this creates a bad situation all over. So that's where we are. And of course, now it's this was like in 2013. Now we've got the sort of added angle of some of the really crazy transgender stuff, which wasn't really as much of it.
Let's chat about that. Let's chat about that real quick.
Okay. Now, yeah, and then we're probably going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely, because we've been on for a while. I mean, I appreciate your time very much.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm happy. Fun. I mean, it's very nice to have this sort of unhurried and
yeah, absolutely. So, I assume you're somewhat familiar with Judith Butler. Yeah, and so. I was thinking about a concept that she and a lot of other feminists push, the idea of gender as performativity, the idea that gender is this performative thing, that the argument goes, if gender is based on actions, then you can use those actions to have different expressions of gender and therefore escape the binary or whatever. I think that's what the
Right.
idea is saying. Now, this idea appears to be a foundation of a lot of trans identity actions. Of course, there are other kind of thoughts in the gender
Right.
and in the sort of gender critique sphere of people like Judith Butler and folks like her. What are your thoughts on Judith Butler's ideas about gender, and what do you think about the concept of transgenderism? Because on the right, there seems to be two camps. There seems to be one camp that says, well, people who are transgender are suffering from gender dysphoria. Therefore, they're mentally ill and they need to be helped. Then there appears to be a different camp that says, well, no, people who are transgender, they can have right-leaning beliefs and they're not necessarily mentally ill, even if there are folks who have the dysphoria. Not all have that dysphoria. That's probably the part where I'm more into. But
Right.
I do think, though, that the sort of trivialization of gender and sex in general is a huge problem, because sex does exist, in my opinion, and gender does have concrete foundations to it.
Oh, of course.
So
Yeah.
what do you think about Judith Butler and the conceptual
Well, I think,
transgenderism?
I think Judith Butler, this is where we get really into some of the very heavy kind of postmodernist stuff. And I think a lot of it is really just semantic games, because I think, obviously Judith Butler has a point in that there is such a thing as the social construction of gender, in terms of like the fact that the way that specific like gender roles are constructed in different cultures obviously have even if there are certain underlying like sex differences, there are still like massive cultural systems that are built around like specifically how that's expressed. Just to take one obvious example, like in our culture, wearing makeup is something that's associated specifically with women. Right? Men do not, unless like they're going on television and like they're, they will, put makeup on your face. But generally speaking, like facial makeup is something that is associated with women. On the other hand, there have been plenty of cultures where that was not the case. Even like as late as 18th century Europe, it was entirely normal for upper class men as well as women to wear facial makeup, to have these things that used to be called beauty marks, where you like applied these little things to your face to highlight certain features. This just as men used to wear clothes that had lace and ruffles and things that today we would consider like extremely feminine. Lots of other examples like that, where certain things that, we consider, there's this, the thing that sort of never ceases to amuse me, where somebody comes across like, letters that some person in the 18th or 19th century wrote to a male friend, and they're going like, oh, he was gay because he's writing stuff like, my dearest friend, I cannot wait for the moment when I clasp you in my, warm embrace and stuff like. But that's actually how men like talk to their friends at the time. It was considered perfectly normal. It was considered like, it was considered entirely normal, for instance, like for male roommates in college to sleep in the same bed, because bed sheets were extremely expensive and difficult to wash. So like you just sort of, it was like there was nothing gay about two guys sharing a bed. Obviously there are lots of things about the way that gender roles play out that are totally cultural. And I think, Butler sort of uses that obvious fact. But I think this is where, my problem with Butler really, and with a lot of the sort of gender discourse, is that there's a kind of substitution, like they use gender. It's like there are three different things. There's gender, which is really like I guess the identity that is connected to your biological sex. The way that we that people normally use the word, like, if you're a female, biologically, generally speaking, like, you also have a feminine gender. Uh, so Butler sort of conflates gender with gender roles, or gender norms, and I think that's really my problem. And then she conflates gender with sex. So it's like there's three different things, like gender identity, gender roles, and sex, that all three kind of get conflated. And that's, that is a problem. I mean, I think that there is such I mean, there's a number of like so-called gender critical feminists who believe that there is no such thing as gender identity at all. So, there is that point of view. I mean, I think that there clearly is such a thing as gender identity. I absolutely believe that there are some people who, who have a male like anatomy, but have a very strong sense of a female gender identity, and vice versa. I think there is, there is a theory that, in many cases, this is like part of something being slightly off and like the wiring of the brain, like something like where normally like gender identity has a lot to do with like prenatal hormones, and then the way that that kind of plays into child development. And then it may be that for some people that sort of switch just doesn't get properly activated. So I think we really, at this point, we still don't, there's just so much that we don't know about the science of the human brain, that I think it's very kind of arrogant, really, to say that, well, no, we know for sure that there is no such thing as like gender identity that can be different from your biological sex, and if that's the case, you're really just like mentally ill and need treatment. No, I mean, I think I've known transgender people over the course of my life. I actually, when I was in college back in, this was even before I went to Rutgers, I spent a couple of years at a community college in New Jersey, because, as an immigrant, I was kind of, adapting to the American educational system. So I sort of started at this easier level, and I also got my high school equivalency diploma there. So this was a place called Brookdale Community College, which is actually one of the better community colleges in New Jersey. I had some very nice experiences there. And I took a class on human sexuality, where our instructor, who was actually really, really good, at one point brought, like, we had a chapter where, talking about transgender. At the time it was called transsexual, by the way. There was no such word as transgender. And she actually brought in, like, when we had that unit as part of the class, she brought in a transgender woman to talk to us. This woman, by the way, and she was someone, like, if I had seen her, I would never have, been able to tell that, she was not someone who was born female. She was, quite an attractive woman. I mean, like, maybe if you took a really close look at her, her hands and feet were a little bigger than, normal for women. But I mean, who's going to stare at hands and feet, really, when you're talking to a person? So no, I mean, I think she like passed perfectly well. And she was a student, by the way, also at this school. And I actually remember that at the end of her talk, she said, like, by the way, like, if you see me like in the cafeteria, like, please don't come up to me and yell, "Oh, you're the transsexual who spoke to my class," like, because at the time I think most transsexuals were really just, they really didn't want it to be like widely known that they were not born female. But she spoke about her experiences, and it was, I mean, I thought it was very compelling. And I mean, I really, like, at the end of this, I really felt like, if this is the way that this person is happy, I don't really see any reason why she, shouldn't live the way she does. And I had a couple of experiences later on with trans people that I met on internet forums. And, I mean, I really do strongly believe that, ultimately, if this is the way that you feel you need to live, in order to be yourself, and, it really isn't, isn't anyone else's business.
Agreed.
I think where things started going a little bit off the rails in, like, in the last decade, is when we got to, first of all, the whole self-ID thing, which is the notion that, you like you can look like I don't know, you can look like Donald Trump, and you can say that you're a woman, and and everyone, like, all it takes for you to like be considered a woman is to just really say I'm a woman, and like maybe use a couple of like external attributes of feminine gender roles, like, I don't know, you can put on a little bit of lipstick and like eyeshadow, and voila, or you can use the ladies robe, so I think that that's and this is really, I mean, I think people who talk about the bathroom bills, which say that you have to use the bathroom corresponding to your biological sex, which I think is really very unproductive, because ultimately, like, if you're someone who looks, I mean, first of all, like, if you've had gender reassignment surgery, like, even if they force you to take your pants off, they're not going to be able to tell that you were not born biologically female. But also, like, you're not going to have like, a genital patrol by the entrance to the bathroom. So, I mean, I think that that's those were very misguided. I mean, I
Agreed.
do think that I think this stems to a certain extent from like the fact that with self-ID, you could have someone who really, does not like in the least bit like pass as female. Like, you could walk into a ladies' room and,
Oh, everyone would be scared.
yeah, right. And or like I could walk into the men's room, and and I'm sure, it's not quite the same thing, but I'm sure a lot of guys would also be very uncomfortable. I mean, I actually spoke to a woman whose son-in-law was a college student who at some college in New York, where they made like all the bathrooms gender neutral, and he had actually started to like leave the building and use the bathroom in a restaurant next door, because he just really didn't feel comfortable like being at a urinal when you have like girls walking by. And I think most people really do not want like gender integrated multi-user bathrooms. I'm pretty certain that I speak for the majority when I say that. So yeah, I mean, that's I think the self-ID thing was really the beginning of a lot of these problems, where suddenly you saw these articles by people who were like, well, I know that I don't pass as a woman, but I'm still going to be offended when people don't automatically treat me as a woman. Well, I think that's your problem then. And I think, I mean, I think you can. The issue for me is that I think you have the right to live like in any way you want to, but you really cannot dictate to other people how they should react to you.
Exactly. That's the
And
problem.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think, obviously we agree on that as well. And I think this is where a lot of these issues come from. But I think even beyond that, I think it's, where we've been seeing an attempt to kind of re-engineer the basic concepts of man and woman. We're now seeing like, stuff like, well, yeah, I don't know if you saw this article on Barry Weiss's Substack, that was actually written by Katie Herzog, about some of the stuff that goes on in the medical schools, where we have these, woke students policing professors for supposedly inappropriate use of pronouns, and say, we're not just pronouns, but for instance, things like, oh, you shouldn't say pregnant women, because, what about pregnant people who consider themselves either male or non-binary? And it's like, come on, this is just ridiculous. And I mean, there is such a thing as the female sex, which is, the sex that reproduces. And I mean, I also think that like if you're going to insist on using inclusive language, because like there's a tiny, and I'm not even going to get into the non-binary thing, because honestly, I think that is really just this narcissistic thing where, like I'm basically straight and cisgender, but I really want a special identity where, where you're going to have to refer to me by some, made up pronoun. So yeah, but I mean, apart from that, it's like there's a tiny minority of people who, you know, and I'm not even going to get into like all the medical repercussions of that, because there are people who are, transgender men who have undergone like extensive hormone treatment, and in some cases may actually, look pretty much male, who still have their like female anatomy, and who in some cases do get pregnant. Um, I I mean, I've read that supposedly this doesn't have any impact on like child development and fetal development, given like just the sheer level of like the male hormones in the body that it takes for someone to like basically like develop a male appearance. I would be very surprised if this was like completely without consequences for like pregnancy and childbirth. But even if like let's say that that's perfectly okay, you're still going to have like, first of all, that's a very tiny minority. I mean, to change our entire language for like 1.0001% of like people who are giving birth who identify and like actually present as male is ridiculous. But also, those people are going to have like very specific needs. So if you're going to talk about being inclusive in, let's say, like outreach to pregnant women, those people who are like technically in some sense male, who are also capable of being pregnant and giving birth, they're going to have like very specific health needs that are not going to be addressed by like general messaging toward, geared to pregnant women. So I don't really, I mean, this idea that literature addressing pregnant women needs to be like gender inclusive and say, like pregnant people, because a few of the people who are giving birth are men. I mean, come on, this is just bizarre. I mean, I don't understand why you can't have like brochures for pregnant women and then like separate, like if you have transgender healthcare outreach, why not have like brochures for like if you're transgender and considering giving birth, this is what you need to know, because it's going to be a whole different ballgame, because usually you have to stop taking hormones, and so I think that's I mean, this idea that being inclusive means that you have to like throw your brain out and just really just unquestionably accept whatever somebody says about their identity is crazy. So I think I think that we are going to see more pushback to that, because, and it's an interesting conflict, between some of the radical feminists and the transgender people. And I will say that I have really mixed feelings about some of those conflicts, because in some of them, I don't really like anyone on either side of this, because, on one side, there are these really crazy kind of transgender activists who will totally insist that there is no such thing as biologically male or female. And, if you say that you're a woman, even if you have like a beard and, intact male anatomy. And I mean, the question, of course, is like, what is a woman? I mean, why do we even have the concept of woman? If it's that disconnected from biology, which is, is totally crazy. And then on the other side, I think there are some radical feminists who, I mean, they're not even so much, transphobic as they're anti-male. And I think they really just believe that, anyone who has or has ever had a penis is kind of inherently evil and violent. So, you do have these two kind of opposing forces where I really kind of want them both to lose. And, but on the other hand, I think that there is some, there are some very sane and reasonable feminist critiques of some of this more extreme transgender stuff. And I think there is really no reason why both of these concerns cannot be accommodated. But I think we live in this very kind of extremist age where you do have the sort of the social justice zealots who believe that unless you have this like perfect utopia where everyone can have their identity catered to like 24 hours a day, then it's like horrible social injustice. And of course, what they don't realize is that there's no way that you can cater to everyone's identity, because at one point, like, one person's identity is going to come into conflict with another's. And this is where we get these bizarre situations where, we have, like, there are lesbians who complain about being, pressured into, like, being open at least to having sex with, a trans woman who has a penis. And, you don't really have to regard people with penises as evil, to just say, well, I'm a lesbian. That means, I'm sexually attracted to female bodies, and I really don't want to have a partner who has, like, male anatomy, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, I don't think that's bigoted,
No,
and
it's
no,
not.
you don't need to, like, and I've seen people say, well, we're not really saying that you're bigoted. We're just saying that you need to, like, re-examine your prejudices. No, you don't actually. You're just, you're a lesbian. That's it. Like, you're attracted to female bodies. And, if someone wants you to, like, delve into, well, why do you think that a body with a penis is not female? Really? Like, is that the question?
Yeah.
I think the answer to that is because it isn't,
Right. Exactly.
I mean, I
Exactly.
think it's perfectly fine, like, and I think, there have been some really stupid things, like, in the like, radical feminist community, where there was, like, the Michigan Women's Music Festival, like, absolutely, like, banned attendance by anyone who was born male, like, even if they had like, gender reassignment surgery. And I was like, what, you're gonna catch, like, man cooties because this person who was born with a penis is gonna be in your midst? I mean, that's ridiculous. But
Yeah.
but it's like we've gone from one extreme to another, where, now someone is claiming that they should be able to, like, walk into a spa with, into the nude area with their, penis and testicles. And if somebody, and, like, what's wrong with you? You have a problem with, like, different kinds of female bodies? Yeah, like, no, that's not a female body, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
No.
so I think on
I.
this interesting note, I think we should
Yeah. Yeah.
wrap this up.
We have
This has been a lot of
absolutely.
fun.
It's been great. Kathy, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really appreciative.
Well, thank you,
Um.
and please let me know when this goes on,
Oh,
because, I'm looking forward to
absolutely.
this one, really.
Absolutely. And is there anything else you'd like to say to my guest or to me before I close
Oh,
it out?
um, right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to, like, seeing you again on Twitter. We haven't even, like, gotten to the part of my, of talking about my Twitter battles, but I think, we'll leave those alone for the moment.
Uh,
Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think I would just encourage everyone to keep an open mind about everything. I mean, not open to the point where, where your brain, I mean, there's a great line that somebody had about, like, being so open-minded that your brain falls out. No, I mean, don't be that open-minded. Like, but, generally speaking, I think most of the time, there really are two sides, or at least, usually more than two sides to most issues. And I think you should definitely be open to considering those. And, do not demonize your opponents. Most of the time, again, with certain exceptions, I think they're, people who disagree with you really just disagree with you. They have a
right.
different vision of what is right. And I think, and your job, if you want to persuade them, is to change their mind through a dialogue. And
Right.
that's that. So, keep it real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much for coming. And everyone else, thank you so much for watching. And please stay pensive. Bye, guys. Have a nice day.